On this video, we wanted to focus more specifically on Taoism, and we wanted to look at identify some of its primary ideas and values, and say a little bit about the divisions that develop within it as well. Previously, we did a couple of other videos on religions in China. Initially, we did a video just called The Great Religion, and following the lead of Houston Smith, who maintained that the Chinese didn't feel a need to embrace one religion to the exclusion of others, and that the Chinese were comfortable with kind of simultaneously embracing Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. And they didn't compete with one another, but you might appeal to one of those religions with, in terms of what you needed in a specific situation. So in that video, we also started to talk about the yin-yang symbol and the values associated with it, and which seem to be very much in evidence in Chinese thought. Following that video, we did a presentation on Confucianism, and I think in that presentation it became pretty evident that you could think of Confucianism as a Yang philosophy. And in this case, we're going to look at Taoism, and I think it becomes pretty evident as we look at Taoism that it is clearly a yin way of thinking about things. So that's what we're going to try to do here. I mean, one other thing I would say is that we've tried to include here is a bit on the influence that Taoism has had on art. You can say that in Confucius very much appreciated art and thought it was an important part of individual and cultural development, that people develop a kind of aesthetic sensibility on things. But I think in the final analysis, we'd have to say that Taoism has inspired a lot more art than Confucianism has. And we could begin with this image on my right here, which is an image of Lao Tzu riding on his water buffalo. That's a story we're going to relate and after a couple of slides here. We start once again, as we did in our presentation of Confucianism, with the yin-yang symbol. If you've looked at the Tao Te Ching, this symbol and what it represents is present on almost every page of that text. And again, it just is a depiction of the interaction between opposing forces that make up nature, our own life in nature as well. And maybe we could say that Taoism is a teaching that's trying to help us find a balance between these two forces within ourselves. The founder of Taoism is usually said to be Lao Tzu, and the date of his birth, we're going to say, is roughly 604 BCE. Lao Tzu is kind of a legendary figure. It's unclear whether he even existed, but the teaching definitely exists, and it's attributed in general to him, although there are other contributors that also add to the teaching, primarily Chuang Tzu,
which we'll mention a little bit later. This is the same time period that we said that Confucius was alive. So if it's true that Lao Tzu was born around 604, him and Confucius might have existed during the same time. And there are some stories that at least on one occasion they met each other. But clearly their approaches to life or their philosophies are quite different. The basic legend which we get about Lao Tzu is, and again, he's still a mysterious figure. Not a lot is known about his history, but it's said of him that at a certain point, I'm assuming later in his career, that he became discouraged about the people's carelessness, or how do you understand that? I mean, it sounds like that people weren't sort of interested in his teaching or interested in sort of understanding life better, actually. So he decided that he was going to leave China, and he headed off in the direction of Tibet, riding on a water buffalo. As the story goes, when he arrived at the border at Hankow Pass, the gatekeeper recognized him and was interested in his teaching and asked him if he would not leave. But if he insisted on leaving, then would he first, before he left, would he leave a record of what his teaching was? So Lao Tzu agreed and sort of went somewhere, and 3 days later he returned and had written the Tao Te Ching, which he gave to the gatekeeper. The usual translation, I mean, there's some disagreement about this as well, but the translation of that title, we're going to say, is The Way and Its Power. Some legends in various cultures inspire artwork, and that's certainly the case in China. So there's a number of representations of this legend of Lao Tzu riding on his water buffalo north to the border of Tibet, and sort of this is one of them. You see him on his water buffalo in the background. We assume that's the gate at the Hankow Pass.
Here's another example of the same theme. I suspect that there's more to this story of Lao Tzu riding on his water buffalo than meets the eye. I think I know in Buddhist traditions there's a series of drawings somewhat similar called the 10 Bulls, in which the bull represents a kind of energy or an aspect of ourselves that has to be mastered. So in the 10 bulls, the pupil, I mean, has to find the bull, and then he has to capture it, then he has to train it, and ultimately he rides it. So there's something about the bull represents mastery over a certain kind of energy that's necessary for a spiritual journey.
Now, this is another representation of that same story with Lao Tzu riding on a water buffalo. I like this one better, although it doesn't represent the idea that there's a past there and so forth. But each of the artworks, I mean, it's not like anyone knows exactly what Lao Tzu looked like, so sort of the artist decides how to represent him. Yeah, this is an interesting one. Okay, looking at the Houston Smith's textbook presentation on Taoism, point out that he begins by discussing this title of the classic text of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. And he begins with this by taking each of the words and expanding on how they should be understood. So he starts with, what does Tao actually mean? And simply, it can be referred to as a path or the way. But there are different ways of understanding what that means. And he gives the three different ways. The first one is that the Tao is the way of ultimate reality. And in this sense, Tao is something which is transcendent, or something which has its existence beyond the known world, or the world that we're familiar with. So because it's beyond, it's unknowable for us as human beings, although we may deduce certain things about it, but there is this sense that the Tao is beyond the complete understanding of human beings. This particular meaning is plays prominently in the very first stanza of the Tao Te Ching, which if you've looked at it, you would realize, and that the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. And so there's this kind of sense that the Tao is beyond our understanding as human beings. But there are other ways to understand it that have to be included. And the second one is that the way, or the Tao, refers to something which is immanent in this world, which is part of this world. And here it's referred to as the spiritual power of nature, or the word spirit or spiritual sort of brings a lot of connotations, and it's hard to figure how to use it in relationship with the Tao. But you see that whatever the force is that drives everything in the world that we live in, the forces of nature, maybe even the laws that govern nature, you can refer to that as the Tao. It's a part of nature. This force or power is in Taoism is also referred to as the mother of the world. And I think in the Tao Te Ching you see some references to that. The third meaning or sense of Tao, we could say, is the Tao is the way of human existence in its relationship with the Tao of the universe. That's the meaning of the Tao in the second sense here. And I think that's really what most of the Taoist teaching that we're going to take a look at. This sense of the way of life is how can we as human beings live in such a way that we can correspond or be in harmony with the way things actually are in the natural world. So that's kind of a relationship between meaning 2 and meaning 3. But we can't forget that ultimately there's the understanding of Tao is also in the first meaning, so it's kind of beyond us. So there's always this element of mystery included. As Smith continues his analysis, he moves to the second word in the title, the Tao Te Ching. The second word is Te. And if we recall, we saw that word in Confucianism. It's one of the Confucianist ideals. And simply it means power. In Confucianism, it referred to power. And it also in in Taoism is sometimes the title was referred to as the way and its power. So what do we mean when we say the power associated with the Tao, or one of the ways to understand it as energy, that everything in nature uh, can be viewed as uh, involving a kind of energy or exchanges of energy and so forth. So there, this idea that there's a kind of energy available or in play in nature can be related to in different ways. And in Taoism, there's three primary ways that this energy is approached. And in the way Smith breaks it down, at least this gives us three different forms of Taoism that we're going to take a look at. The first one is, in my view, in my treatment of this subject, is the most interesting from a philosophical point of view. And there is a sense where Taoism can be viewed as a religion that will be our third sense. But if we start with Taoism as a philosophy, we'd say, and which is the way a lot of people would approach it, say what the emphasis is on developing some kind of wisdom or understanding of the world and of our place in the world through the study of the Taoist teachings. Smith says this involves learning how aims at an efficient use of the energy that's available to us. A better understanding would keep us from wasting energy or making more efficient use of the energy that is available to us. So that would involve studying the teachings of Lao Tzu and then also Chuang Tzu. Lao Tzu would say gives us the Tao Te Ching. Chuang Tzu is the text associated with Chuang Tzu. It has the same name as Chuang Tzu, so it's just Chuang Tzu. And in both cases, the aim seems to be to find a way to go with the flow of nature, so that nature is dynamic. It's always moving, flows maybe like a river, and we want to not go against the current, but try to find ways to go with the flow. And for that, you try and live an existence where you avoid friction, you avoid going against things, and you avoid conflicts, and in particular, you avoid any forms of violence. And the aim is to cultivate a particular state of mind or state of consciousness, maybe woo-wee. And it's difficult to say what this state is. It's, in some sense, I want to say it's similar to Buddhist mindfulness, but it's here, the general translation, it's inaction or kind of non-doing. So, but it might be better to express it euphemistically, or it's pure effectiveness, or it's not pure passivity, but it's kind of, in my view, it involves an activity. It is a kind of action. You can never not act, but you can act in a way which is more relaxed than the way we ordinarily do. And it's like our tensions make our friction, our tensions sort of provide conflict for us and so forth. So there is still a striving in Taoism, but one's trying to get to make a particular kind of, what they say, contradictory terms, striving effortlessly, or trying to make an effortless effort. Essentially, I think take this quote from Huston Smith's treatment, where he says that, Taoist is trying to live his life in harmony with nature, trying to ride and delight in the boundless flow. The second form of Taoism that Smith identifies, I'm just going to refer to as Taoism as a practice. The aim here is not so much understanding, but to make use of techniques or practices which will increase the amount of energy that we have available for our own use. So it's not quite the same as the efficient use of energy, but here we're trying to augment the energy or the power that is available to us in nature. So a lot of these practices seek to increase the available te. A lot of attention is paid to qi, breath or vital energy. You see a lot of martial arts might have this kind of focus, and again, or it can be trying to remove obstacles to the flow of energy and that exists within us as human beings or around us as human beings. When you think of acupuncture, which is a kind of therapeutic science that emerges out of ancient Chinese teaching, and I'm assuming similar to the principles of Taoism, where they're trying to remove obstacles to the flow of energy by inserting needles at certain points within the body and so forth. Or even the practice of feng shui, which is focused on how energy moves in the living spaces that we inhabit, and how things can be arranged in more positive ways for us to enable energy to flow more freely. These practices can be focused on the materials or movement, ways in which we move, or practices related to the mind. People will eat certain types of foods, herbs, and so forth, or even work with sexual energy, which we may have seen in some forms of Hinduism as well, the energy related with sexual aspects of ourselves as humans being very special, kind of high quality energy. And a lot of religious teachings have try to find ways of converting that kind of energy in for like the development of spirituality within a human being. Movement are like exercises or like, again, martial arts type practices, which have the additional aim of improving circularity, maybe like yoga does in the way people practice it here. So there are exercise programs like Tai Chi Chuan and combinations of practices. Qigong, Falun Gong are like combinations of physical movements and sort of meditative practices to achieve the same, to enhance the quality and the amount of energy that we have available to us as human beings. Mind is a part of this, and it looks like meditation, similar to what we already saw in Raja Yoga in Hinduism and in Buddhism, where meditation is a primary focus for work on oneself or trying to improve the quality of our life. So this same practice is made use of within Taoism. So there's a lot of overlap in this area. And there's a feeling here that if enough people would practice meditation and accumulate this kind of spiritual energy, within themselves, that it could be a benefit to all people. Then third form of Taoism is Taoism as religion. So, and Smith refers to this as vicarious power, and just means that there is the power or the energy that's available in the workings of nature can be made available to the common people who don't have the time to do the kind of work or exercise programs that the other forms of diet or study that the other forms of Taoism do, can be helped by priests who will perform ceremonies and rituals and so forth, which are intended to transfer power or make this kind of power available to people for the various needs that they have. So you could say that there's some superstition and magic involved if we understand both of those as both of those terms as the attempt to transfer energy, or if you say what occult powers are captured or whatever, and then made available sort of in the visible world for people who need them. I mean, priests might bless fields or homes, things like that. There's also a number of ceremonies. There's a link that I'm going to provide on some of the notes that I'll put up a little bit later to a video, which will give some sense of what Taoism as a religious practice looks like. It is worth mentioning that the Taoism as a religion sort of differs from Taoism as philosophy and also as Taoism as practical. Both philosophy and the practical application, you could say they offer something to people in the way of self-help. In other words, people can follow a program or a path, a study to help them along the way. And it's a kind of work on oneself that one can undertake. And in most cases, people make use of teachers or guides in order to make progress on that path. So Taoism as a religion is different for those who don't have the time or the inclination to engage in that. I just wanted to include this list of general characteristics of Taoism that we find that kind of run throughout whatever form of Taoism that we're looking at. In general, this idea there is a creative energy or an energy available that we can tap into as human beings. In order to have access to it, stillness and quiet are helpful. It's not different from, I don't think, from what one might understand in Buddhism or in some strains of Hinduism as well. This idea of meditative practice or just being still enough or quiet enough to connect with a deeper source of energy within oneself. Sometimes we think of that as getting in touch with a divinity, which might be within, but energy might also be a way to think of it. Simplicity also is related to the stillness and the quiet. We're trying to live existences which are relatively simple, not too complicated. It creates more difficulty for us to be quiet and still within ourselves. Selflessness is certainly a characteristic that's emphasized in the Tao Te Ching, and humility, sort of not allowing your ego to run free within yourself. So that's a quality that helps us be related to other sources of energy within. Naturalness is another common idea, trying to live a life which corresponds with nature. It'd be hard pressed to say what does it mean to be natural. For one thing, you could say it does mean having a kind of relationship with the body, and that the body is what grounds us in the natural world. Not to be too lost in thought or our emotions so much, but to live naturally means to be grounded and to be related to the physicality of our existence. And then these other terms are all related, passivity, a kind of passivity. I mean, that term just evokes negative thoughts in us, I think, but a certain kind of passivity, openness, receptivity, maybe better ways to say passivity. And again, non-violence in particular. Water is frequently used as a metaphor for the Tao. Again, the idea that what one's trying to be related to is something that's always in motion and sort of flowing, has its own rules for how it works, gathers in low places, and so on. And finally, just a way of thinking about or portraying some of the Taoist principles. You see, Taoism has inspired a lot of art and architecture within China. So we'll see that in a lot of the artistic depictions of human beings and human dwellings are placed within much larger dominating landscapes of water and mountains. And humans are often portrayed as being on a journey in their life. I have a few pictures which will illustrate. Here's one example of Taoist landscape paintings. This one's oftentimes it's hard to even find people in these paintings or these drawings. And if you look closely, though, usually you can find them, and you see that really people are pretty small compared to the settings in which they live. So here you can see, I believe this is somebody walking or two people, for my eyes aren't so good. But there's, they're walking somewhere and the dwellings are over here, but it's really, massive, overwhelming kind of landscape. Here's another picture. It's a little easier to see in the human figure. And again, sort of walking, and oftentimes walking across a bridge, across water. And just another example of the same principle is, you say these paintings kind of help us have a perspective of our place in nature, and that we're really pretty small, compared to the worlds in which we live.
This painting is entitled Poet on a Mountaintop. If you look towards the right of the painting, on the side of the mountain, you can see a dwelling, which is apparently where the poet lives. And you see that the poet has climbed up onto the highest point, as though he's seeking inspiration from exposing himself to great nature and allowing himself to feel kind of humbleness in the face of all that. And I believe that that's what needs to be expressed to put us into our place. Okay, I'm beating this drum rather persistently here, but this is the last work of art that we'll take a look at, and it's kind of fun to look at them once you get into them. This one is entitled Walking on a Mountain Path in the Springtime, and it shows the primary figure kind of paused on the path and almost in a reverie, looking at the flowers and the birds, and just taking in the beauty of nature. And this, I think in the, oh, I don't know, Chinese, but I think in the upper right segment of this picture is a poem which reflects what's going on in this painting, to the effect that the Taoist scholar or sage is really kind of wants nothing more than to be at one with nature and to appreciate that relationship. So we'll let it go for now.
One other reference that I wanted to make use of is this. For me, it's kind of a classic text, but I don't think so many people are aware of it. There's a little book was written by Benjamin Hoff and called The Tao of Pooh. I mean, for those who are familiar with the Pooh Bear stories, Benjamin Hoff thought that they provided a good metaphor or to use in order to talk about Taoism. So some of the things you can get from this story is you see the different characters represent different ways in which you could live your life, and you have Eeyore, who's always kind of fretting about everything or sees everything as though there's a cloud above his head, and is one type of person we could be. Piglet represents another type of person who's timid and shy and always hesitating before he does anything. Then there's Rabbit, who's kind of a busybody, who's constantly running around and sort of trying to do tons of things, so never sort of not being busy. And then there's the Owl character, and Owl's always kind of pontificating, using, sophisticated language, but obviously kind of ignorant of the meaning of much of what he has to say. And then you have, in contrast, the Pooh Bear. And Pooh Bear represents, in Hoff's view, what kind of the ideal of Taoism, simplicity. Clearly, Pooh Bear is a very simple bear. Pooh is not an intellectual by any stretch of the imagination. I think the descriptive phrase, Pooh is a bear of little brain, is frequently employed. So Pooh just exists very simply. And that seems to be something that the Taoist aims at. Even though Pooh is simple and, he just wants his honey and to exist the way that he does, he usually ends up doing the right thing. So I think that's part of what the Taoists think, how that's the way we should try to be. It's kind of like being childlike in some sense. Finally, I wanted to include this little passage, which is also included in Benjamin Hoff's book, The Tao of Pooh, and where he discusses this another classic theme in China, that there was this a number of portrayals of this scene where you have the three masters together, and they're called the vinegar tasters. So you have Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu all around a large jar of vinegar. And the vinegar is supposed to represent the taste of life. And then you have their responses to it. And you see that for Confucius, he tastes life for him is sour. And his solution is that we need better societal norms in order to improve life, to make it better. Buddha tastes from the same vat, and for him, life has a bitter taste. And it involves too much suffering. So for Buddha to lessen the extent to which human beings suffer, you have a program to eliminate desires as much as possible in human beings. Lao Tzu, though, and taste of vinegar, and he just smiles. And life for him is fine just the way that it is. It doesn't need any fixing. So if you let go of all your attempts to try to make things better or to make changes in your existence and just accept things the way that they are, that we'd all be better off as a result.